The provincial government relied on legislation that allowed them to do this for, quote-unquote, non-Christian tribes. Many of the Mangyans, however, at that time, were already Christianized. After reviewing the colonial history in the Philippines and efforts of colonial administrators, the Supreme Court declared, in resume, therefore, the legislature and the judiciary inferentially and different executive officials specifically join in the proposition that the term non-Christian refers not to religious belief, but in a way to geographical area and more directly to natives of the Philippine Islands of a low grade of civilization, usually living in tribal relationship apart from settled communities, close quote. Justifying the denial of habeas corpus, the eminent jurists emphasize, and I quote, segregation really constitutes protection for the Mangyanes. Theoretically, one may assert that all men are created free and equal. Practically, we know that the axiom is not precisely accurate. The Mangyans, for instance, are not free, as civilized men are free, and they are not equals of their more fortunate brothers. True indeed, they are citizens, but with many but not all the rights which citizenship implies. And true indeed, they are Filipinos. But just as surely, the Mangyanes are of a low degree of intelligence and Filipinos who are a drag upon the progress of the state, close quote. This was followed by cases such as People versus Kayat, where the Philippine Supreme Court placed judicial imprimatur on government action discriminating against a cultural minority. Act 1639 penalized any member of a non-Christian tribe to possess or drink intoxicating liquor other than native wine. This law was declared constitutional and not discriminatory. After all, according to this case, there was a rational relationship between the use of state's police power and the vulnerability of these tribes. Parenthetically, People versus Kayat is a staple for all constitutional law 2 classes. The discrimination, however, is clearer to those who are uninitiated in the processes of formal legal reasoning. The more general the textual basis of rights from which minority or marginalized cultures, the lesser chances are for an interpretation in their favor. Judicial tendency might be to treat the usual state of affairs as the norm, or has been the experience of many lawyers working for the marginalized, that the resources of those who are privileged simply dwarf their efforts. Justices work with their own experiences and isolate observable characteristics of complex communities in the hope of making the concepts and processes workable for other judges in future cases. In other words, there is a marked tendency to simplify, reduce, or essentialize communities into a number of characteristics. Unfortunately, having a low grade of civilization was the best that our jurists at that time could discover. On October 29, 1997, the President of the Republic of the Philippines signed Republic Act 8371 into law. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act prohibits discrimination among indigenous peoples. Ethnicity is now an unacceptable basis for classification unless it is, open quote, due recognition of the characteristics and identity, close quote, of a member of a class of indigenous peoples. Classification of peoples into indigenous and non-indigenous is now allowed only to provide affirmative action in their favor. Politically, the specific term indigenous cultural communities in the 1987 Constitution was in recognition of the intricacies and complexities of culture and its continuity in defining ancestral lands and domains. The choice of indigenous peoples in the IPRA, as well as the recognition and promotion of their rights, was a departure from the negative stereotypes instilled by our colonizers. These prejudices against the cultural minorities and the non-Christian tribes effectively pictured indigenous peoples then as backward and therefore incapable of natural resource management. Section 3H of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act defines indigenous cultural communities / indigenous peoples. The term indigenous peoples refer to a group of peoples or homogeneous societies The distinction recognizes situations where the communities have intermarried or partially allowed, to some extent, non-natives. The provision suggests that fundamental mode of determining who indigenous people are would be self-ascription and ascription by others. Self-ascription is an important qualifier and one which can be self-explanatory. But standing alone, it does not make judicial sense. Individuals or communities wanting to make use of special rights provided in the law would simply claim to be indigenous. What matters, therefore, would be the parameters of the second requirement, which is ascription by others. Here, the law presents three possible criteria. The first criterion acknowledges relationship to territory and the uniqueness of the group's culture. Indigenous peoples are those who have continuously lived as organized community on communally bounded and defined territory, and who have, under claims of ownership since time immemorial, occupied, possessed, and utilized such territories, sharing common bonds of language, custom, tradition, and other distinctive cultural traits, close quote. The second criterion acknowledges distinction through resistance to inroads of both colonization and non-indigenous religions and cultures. Thus, or those who have, through resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-indigenous religion and cultures, become historically differentiated from the majority of Filipinos, close quote. The third criterion traces physical origins of communities and acknowledges distinctions in cultural traits. Thus, peoples who are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from the population which inhabited the country at the time of conquest or colonization, or at the time of inroads of non-indigenous religions and cultures, or the establishment of present state boundaries, who retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, but who have been displaced from their traditional domains, or who may have resettled outside their ancestral domains, close quote. Any of these three criteria would suffice to make ascription by others that a group of people or a homogeneous society would be considered as an indigenous community. Nothing in the law, however, clarifies which criterion should be dominant. Definitely, they could not be taken together. This constitutes the first level of its ambiguity. Interpretation of open-ended terms within each criteria constitutes the second level of ambiguity. The existence of three different sets of criteria reveals three different choices of substantive characteristics of indigenous groups to privilege. The first criterion requires time immemorial relationship to territory and therefore excludes indigenous groups that have migrated or are no longer fully dependent on natural resources. It is therefore biased towards a conception of indigenous groups which remain rural. It even excludes acceptance of individuals or groups that have embraced, quote-unquote, cosmopolitarianism. The second criterion privileges differentiation from the majority of Filipinos. Thus, it requires a definition of the norms for the majority against which indigenous peoples need to be measured. In a subtler way, it therefore preserves the stereotype dichotomy of minority and majority. The third criterion presents the most ambiguity. It emphasizes retention of some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions. It, however, excludes relationship to territory and is not clear with respect to the relationship of retained institutions to that of the majority of Filipinos. It is perhaps this criterion that is being used in the current controversy relating to the Bangsamoro juridical entity. Administrative interpretation adds further complications. Following the tradition of earlier agencies and the possible interpretations of the provisions of the new law, the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, or the NCIP, persists in categorizing indigenous groups by identifying ethno-linguistic groupings. In December 2000, the Supreme Court rendered its ruling in Cruz versus NCIP. Challenge was the constitutionality of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, fundamentally because it violated what allegedly was a fundamental precept with respect to our natural resources, Jura Regalia, or the Regalian Doctrine. The court was evenly divided. 7 of the 14 voted to dismiss the petition. The other 7 wanted portions of the law declared as unconstitutional. By constitutional fiat, and because of the presumption of constitutionality, the challenge failed. Of significance, however, is the characterization of indigenous peoples in the ponentia of various justices. The dominant view carried by Justice Puno was that, and I quote, indigenous peoples share distinctive traits that set them apart from the Filipino mainstream. They are non-Christians. They live in less accessible, marginal, mostly upland areas. They have a system of self-government not dependent upon the laws of the central administration of the Republic of the Philippines. They follow ways of life and customs that are perceived as different from those of the rest of the population. The kind of response the indigenous peoples chose to deal with colonial threat worked well to their advantage by making it difficult for Western concepts and religions to erode their customs and traditions. The infieles societies, which have become peripheral to colonial administration, represented, from a cultural perspective, a much older base of archipelagic culture. The political systems were still structured on the patriarchal and kinship-oriented arrangement of power and authority. The economic activities were governed by the concepts of an ancient communalism and mutual help. The social structure, which emphasized division of labor and distinction of functions, not status, was maintained. The cultural styles and forms of life portraying the varieties of social courtesies and ecological adjustments were kept constantly vibrant. Land is the central element of the indigenous people's existence. There is no traditional concept of permanent individual land ownership. Among the Igorot, ownership of land more accurately applies to the tribal right to use the land or to territorial control. The people are the secondary owners or stewards of the land, and that if a member of the tribe ceases to work, he loses his claim of ownership, and the land reverts to the beings of the spirit world, who are its true and primary owners. Under the concept of trusteeship, the right to possess the land does not only belong to the present generation, but the future ones as well. Close quote. Any advocate of indigenous peoples will say that this does not entirely capture what they are. By law, as well as administrative judicial interpretation, I am not indigenous. So would many of you listening to this lecture. You are just simply Filipinos. In doing so, the law culturally participates in creating what Marion Iris Young calls as the othering. By relying on this legal representation of our identity, we participate in an asymmetrical relationship of power and privilege. By making these identities official, albeit legal, it does make permanent an asymmetrical relationship which Marion Iris Young explains as, where the social relation of the groups is one of privilege and oppression, this attribution of otherness is asymmetrical. While the privileged group is defined as the active subject, inferiorized social groups are objectified, substantialized, reduced to a nature or essence, whereas the privileged groups are neutral, exhibit free, spontaneous, and